Good afternoon, everybody. How many people have just joined us for the first presentation? Just 1, 2, 3, 4. How many people have been here since 9:30 in the morning? And we're still going. That's amazing. Good. Well, the question is, are we ready to go into the depth?
Yeah.
Of course, we're here. Now the question is, who will we dare trust leading us into the depth? Good. I would say a storyteller who has one eye weeping and one eye laughing. That's the person I would trust to lead us into the depth. And I can't think of a better person than Marcus.
Just about to tell a story about the awakening of her heart, and so just to sort of appreciate that that's going on as well, and hold a little bit of her in our hearts. Once upon a time, there was a miller, and he lived in a mill with his wife. Day by day, year by year, the wealth of their mill grew and grew. But calamity can strike overnight. And very soon, the miller found he was losing money day by day, until it got to the point that he could hardly even say that he owned the mill. He didn't know what to do. He tossed and turned. Sleep would not come. One day he arose before daybreak and he walked out of the mill, across the dam, and he stood by the mill pond. As the first rays of sun broke through the sky and bounced off the water, the pond shimmered, and suddenly, by his side, stood the most beautiful woman that he had ever seen. He was nervous and excited, for he knew that this was the Nixie of the mill pond, the water spirit. She called him by his name, and she asked him what his problems were. Well, he was suspicious, but her voice was so warm and soft that he felt a desire to open up and tell her all his woes. Calm yourself, for I can help you. All that you need to do is give me what has just been born into your house, and I will give you riches and happiness for the rest of your days. Well, this seemed like a very good deal to the miller, for what could have been born into his house but a puppy or a kitten? So he made the deal with the Nixie, and he began his journey back to the mill with his spirits lifted. As he got to the mill, their maid walked out with her arms extended and declared that his wife had just given birth to a son. The miller knew right then that he had been tricked by the Nixie. He entered the house. husband, are you not happy with our new baby? What could the miller do but tell her what had happened with the Nixie? The couple were distraught. Nobody could console them. But very soon, prosperity returned to their mill. Everything they did seemed to be a success. It was almost as if the chests and cabinets filled themselves with gold. But, thought the miller, what use is all this happiness if at any time the Nixie can come and claim her debt? He raised his son and made sure that he never went near the mill pond. If your fingers should even touch the surface of the water, he told his son, then the Nixie will drag you down into the depths. So his son always stayed away from the dangerous mill pond. He grew, and when he came of age, he was apprenticed to a local huntsman. He soon became a fine huntsman in his own right. He fell in love with a beautiful maiden from the village, and they were wed. The lord of the village even gifted them a small house. He grew into a fine huntsman, and one day he was out chasing a deer through the forests and out across an open field. And he took out his bow. He killed the deer in one shot. So focused on the hunt had he been that he had not realized that he was near the dangerous mill pond. He knelt down beside the animal and gutted and skinned it. His hands were covered in blood. So he knelt by the side of the pond to wash his hands. No sooner had his fingertips touched the water than the Nixie grabbed his hands and dragged him down into the depths of the mill pond. When the huntsman did not return home, his wife began to feel anxious. This was not like him at all. She knew the stories he had told her of the dangerous mill pond and the Nixie, so she suspected what might have happened. And so she walked through the forest and across the field, and there, by the side of the pond, was the huntsman's bag. She knew right then what had happened to her husband. She paced up and down around the pond. She shouted and lamented at the waters for the Nixie to return her husband. But there was silence. Just the crescent moon gazing back at her from the still waters. She continued to walk round the pond until she grew weary and fell asleep at the side. That night, she dreamt of a huge mountain surrounded by giant white cliffs. She walked up the path. Briars and thorns ripped at her clothes and her skin, but she continued. When she got to the top, the view was completely different. Vast blue skies, a luscious green meadow with wild flowers of every colour imaginable. And there in the centre of the meadow was a small, neat wooden hut. And in the hut was an old woman with white hair. When the huntsman's wife woke in the morning, she knew she had to go to the mountain. She went there and she followed the path exactly as it had appeared in her dream. And when she got to the top, sure enough, that neat little wooden hut was there, and inside, the old woman with white hair from the dream. You must truly have faced a terrible experience, said the old woman, for you have sought out my lonely hut. And so the huntsman's wife explained to the old woman what had happened. Do not worry. Take this golden comb. And when the moon is full in the sky, take the comb and brush your hair by the side of the pond. When you have finished, place it by your feet. Then you will see what will happen. It seemed like an eternity before that moon was full again in the sky. But when it was, she took the golden comb and sat down by the side of the mill pond, and she combed her hair. When she had finished, she placed the comb down on the banks of the pond. The water began to bubble, and a wave rushed out and dragged the comb down into the depths of the pond. As that happened, the water in the centre of the pond began to shimmer, and the huntsman's head rose out from the water. He glanced into her eyes. As he did, a wave came and dragged him back down into the depths. Once more despair filled his wife's heart. Once more she fell asleep by the side of the pond, and once more she dreamt of that mountain and the old woman at the top. When she awoke once more, she travelled to the top of the mountain, and there the old woman told her not to worry and gave her a flute. She said, take this golden flute and under the light of the next full moon, play a tune by the side of the pond, and then you will see what will happen. It seemed like an eternity before the moon was once again full in the sky. But when it was, she took the flute. And by the side of the pond, she played. When she had finished, she placed the flute down by the side of the pond. Once more, the waters began to bubble, and a wave came out and dragged the flute down into the depths of the pond. The waters began to shimmer, and out of the centre of the pond rose the huntsman's head and half of his body, and he reached his arms out her in yearning. She reached her arms out back. Oh, my love! But a wave more violent than the one before came and dragged the huntsman back down into the depths of the pond. Brighton. It's a city not that far from here. I'm sure many of you have been. For those of you that don't know, Brighton Beach has 2 piers. And from where I was standing, I could see them both. To my left, the Palace Pier. Its neon lights unperturbed by the drizzly January weather. The Palace Pier, a symbol of Brighton. A symbol of fun. A symbol of a place where you can really let your hair down. A symbol of a place where you're encouraged to celebrate your weirdness and shout it from the rooftop. That is the Brighton that I arrived in 2005 as a fresh-faced undergraduate. A Brighton of sex and drugs and dancing on the beach under the moonlight after the clubs had kicked out. Then there's the West Pier. A burnt out husk standing in the sea alone. The West Pier had already fallen into a state of disrepair and burnt down 2 years before I arrived in the city. It stands there, its fragile metal frame growing smaller each year as it's battered by the winter rains and waves and storms. The West Pier. Perhaps another symbol of Brighton. A symbol of a city that's partied too hard. A symbol of a city rough around the edges. A symbol of a city of homelessness, huge disparity between rich and poor. The West Pier. And on that day, I felt a lot more like the West Pier than I did the Palace Pier. If I was honest, that whole year leading up to that day had felt a lot more like a West Pier kind of year. I'd been weighed down by depression, but every ounce of my energy was just spent trying to get out of bed and just exist. And that day, the world seemed even heavier than before. And I left the house wearing my Doc Marten boots, my thick black jeans and my heavy winter coat, and I trudged down onto the beach. And I stood and I stared out over the horizon. In the summer, you cannot move on Brighton Beach for people. Every inch of those pebbles are taken up by beach towels, deck chairs, barbecues, picnics. But on this damp, cold January day, there was not another soul in sight. No one, as far as the eye could see, just me, standing there, alone, staring at the horizon. What was the point? What was the point? There is but one truly philosophical problem, said Albert Camus, the French existentialist writer. And that problem is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living, that is to answer the most fundamental question of philosophy. Whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, those are just games. First, one must answer this. Or, as Hamlet put it a little bit more succinctly, to be or not to be? That was my question. Was it nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to face a sea of troubles and by opposing end them? As I stared out over the horizon, the sea had begun to recede a little bit. But I knew that in a few short steps I could be in there and be embraced by the cold clutches of the English Channel, and it could all be over so soon. What was the point? Crunch, 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 crunch. Suddenly, my existential panic crisis was thrown into disarray. As down the beach marauded a gang of Italian language students. A common sight in Brighton. One of them under his arm held a huge speaker. And they walked down the beach smiling and dancing and singing, passing around cans of Carling to each other, and they stopped right in front of me. There was not another soul on the beach. I was furious. Did they not know that they were uninterrupting my conversation with Shakespeare and Camus? I furrowed my brow, and I thought about going over them there and giving them a piece of my mind. But instead I sighed. I turned away and began to stomp grumpily off the beach. I turned round to give them one last angry glance. As I did, something happened. Something in the absurdity of that situation connected with the absurdity of all this. And somewhere, something in this crazy world seemed to make sense. Out of nowhere, a smile seemed to drop from the sky onto my face. And as I left that beach, I was no longer angry. I was laughing. And a smile spread across my face. And I thought to myself, not today, Camus. But back at the mill pond, once more the huntsman's wife was in despair. Twice she had followed the instructions, and twice she had failed to get her husband back. What was the point of being able to see her husband if she could not touch him and hold him and love him? But once more she fell asleep. And once more she dreamt of the old woman at the top of the mountain. Once more, when she awoke, she travelled for a third time to the top. And there the old woman waited. And she told her not to fear, for she had not completed all of the tasks yet. She gave her a golden spinning wheel, and she told her that under the light of the next full moon, she should spin on the spinning wheel until all the flax was off the spool, and then she would see what would happen. Seemed like an eternity, but eventually the moon was once again full in the sky. She took the golden spinning wheel down to the banks of the pond, and she began to spin. She spun and she spun until all the flax was off the spool. As soon as she stopped spinning, the waters began to bubble, and a wave came and dragged that golden spinning wheel down into the depths of the pond. Out of the centre of the pond rose the huntsman's head, his body, his legs, until the whole huntsman was hanging above the pond. He jumped from the pond and he grabbed his wife by the hand, and they fled. But they had only gone a short distance before the waters began to bubble and bubble and bubble and bubble, and a huge wave rose out from the pond. It rushed across the land, destroying crops and buildings, anything in its path. They had already begun to picture their own death, when in one last attempt, the huntsman's wife called out to the old woman on the mountain, "If you can hear me, help us." In that instant, she was transformed into a toad, and the huntsman into a frog. They were carried away by the waters, and both eventually reached dry land and resumed their human form. But they had been separated. Both found themselves in foreign lands with mountains and valleys. To earn a living, the huntsman became a shepherd, and he tended a large flock of sheep. His wife became a shepherdess, and she too attended a large flock of sheep. And in those distant lands they would walk their flocks of sheep, holding the pain of their long lost loves in their heart. One day, the shepherd was on the side of the mountain with his sheep, and he looked across the valley and saw down another mountain coming, a flock of sheep in his direction. And so he drove his sheep towards it. The shepherd and the shepherdess met in the middle of the valley. But in this distant land, they did not recognize each other. Both of them, holding their long lost loves in their heart, were happy for the companionship. And so, from that day on, they drove their sheep together. One day, after a long day of herding their sheep, when the moon was once again full in the sky, they stopped to rest. And the huntsman the shepherd went to his bag. He took out his flute. And he began to play. Why are you crying? For it was under a full moon, just like this, when I last played this tune on my flute for my long lost love in the mill pond. And in that moment, it was as if a veil had dropped from both of their eyes, and they instantly recognized each other. They embraced and they kissed. And nobody here need ask whether they lived in bliss thereafter. Do you understand what I said about the eyes? Do you agree with me? Thank you very much, Marcus, for leading us into the depth. I must thank Roy for lending me his beautiful flute, which I love to steal. Thank you. Break now for tea, coffee, stretch, anything we need. In half an hour, Yusho from Taiwan will tell us the story of the time when she was the ugly duckling in the storytelling hut. And then if people want to continue descending into the depth with the goddess Inanna and with the storyteller Jules, who will
work with the theme of grief and with the Sumerian goddess Inanna here in this room. So half an hour break, a stretch, and please come back for just a little bit. Yeah, we're 13 people.